Mr. Budreau, welcome to Whistler.
Thanks for having me.
London, Ontario, the bastion of filmmakers. I'm just wondering if you could talk about growing up in slightly west of Toronto and what that was like and how that influenced a desire to become a filmmaker.
Yeah, so I grew up in a small town called Ingersoll, which is about an hour and a half from Toronto, and I guess about half an hour from London. And so in Ingersoll, we didn't have a movie theater in our town. We had a theater, but I had to go to London to see movies. And so I just remember growing up, there was a repertory theater there called the New Yorker, and I remember, in my teens, starting to go see a lot of foreign films and a lot of independent movies at the New Yorker in London. I think that's how my kind of love of cinema started. But at that time, I never really realized that you could do that for a living. It just something you could watch and enjoy.
I'm always fascinated by this. What was the film that you saw that first made you think, actually, I might be able to do this? That there was something on screen that you felt a deep connection with as a film. Maybe not a film you would have made, but something that you thought that this is a direction I wish to go in.
The film, I think, that made the most impact on me was Raging Bull, but it certainly didn't make me think I could do that. If anything, I found it just like daunting because I was like, how does one do that? There's no way I could ever do anything like that. It wasn't until later, much later, when I got older and actually came out west and kind of did some film school and film courses that I saw it as like something you can do, as like a business, as opposed to just something you can watch. But in those early years in London, it was just this kind of magical experience of seeing these things.
And were you one of those kids with the Super 8 or the VHS camera sort of making stuff in high school? Or was it not until you went to film school that you sort of really delved into the art form?
Yeah, it wasn't really until film school. I mean, I was the kind of kid that would watch tons of movies, but at that time, growing up in the 80s, it was a little bit harder to, it's not like now with iPhones and stuff, it's so easy to make movies. So there was no real ability to film stuff. And my parents didn't have Super 8s or anything like that around. But I also remember, that growing up with the VHS tapes, we had an uncle who used to kind of have lots of his own pirated VHS tapes. You could watch lots of stuff instead of going to the movies. So I also watched a lot of foreign films, a lot of films on VHS tapes, which was a big thing.
Was there a particular director that you watched back then that you think still holds a strong influence on you now?
In those days, especially in around film school, you get obsessed with a lot of the older directors, and so a lot of those directors aren't around anymore. But I still feel like the influence when I look back on stuff. So if you think about, some of Hitchcock stuff or John Ford, I haven't really had a chance to do anything in the Western genre. I hope to. But even with some of the film noir that I fell in love with in around film school, certainly had a strong impact on the jazz movie I made called Born to Be Blue, which, because that film deals with, black and white iconography of the 50s, which is very much part of the film noir aesthetic. And so, the first film I did out of film school, this little jazz film called Dream Recording was a black and white film noir jazz movie. And so right from the early part of my career, I was kind of connecting that early love of film noir with music. And eventually, like 10 years later, came Born to Be Blue.
But I guess I'm more interested in the jump from being in high school and deciding to come across the country to Vancouver into film school. What was the jump to deciding not to be a hockey player, not to do whatever else that one does from Ingersoll?
I think it was just being exposed to the practicalities of, like, I did an undergraduate degree at McMaster in Hamilton, which is outside of Toronto, and I studied science. I studied biology and psychology. And again, I used to go to the repertory theater in Hamilton all the time and see tons of movies, but maybe it was because my parents were both professionals. My dad was an engineer and my mom was like a geneticist. And so I always had it in my mind, as much as I loved English and film, that I think, I had to do something professional with my life. And And again, it wasn't really until I came out here and saw the industry. I worked for BC Film for a summer, and I got behind the scenes and I saw, oh, I see, like this is a business, and people actually do this. It doesn't just magically appear. And it's surprisingly, I was quite old when that really kind of struck me, I think. And then I kind of got the film bug, and then that was it. And I started making short films, and things progressed.
And so you go to Vancouver Film School. As somebody who's now making films, do you recommend film school?
I do for some people, absolutely. Because first of all, I think it's really important to get the film theory in the background. I really do think that's important. I think if anyone wants to excel in any profession, they need to know the history, and they need to understand what it is. So I find the academic part of film school actually quite important and useful. And then, but it's simultaneously, the practicality of it, just making movies. You don't really get to make that much in film school. And again, even when I went to the Vancouver Film School, which was like in 99 or 2000, the digital video era was starting, but it wasn't the same, and it was still quite costly to do stuff. It's so much cheaper now to make stuff of high quality. So I think people in film school now are making more. It's a bit more practical than it used to be. But for me, film school was a jumping off point for making lots of short films. And I kind of consider that my second film school was just making lots of shorts, lots of indie shorts at low budget in Toronto, and learning and getting to know people that way, honing your craft through short films.
So according to IMDb anyway, your first short film listed was Dylanology, which actually plays an interesting connection when we get to Stockholm. I'm just wondering if you could talk about your connection then with music, and connecting a love of music or a fascination or obsession with music with film, and how you see those two sometimes disparate art forms connected.
Dylanology was the first thing I embarked on. It actually still has never been finished. It was a documentary following kind of Bob Dylan bootleggers on the road and the world behind people obsessed with Bob Dylan. Bob Dylan's always been my biggest musical kind of inspiration, and so I started doing that as a doc. But then that following year is when I did Dream Recording, the jazz film noir. And it was fun for me because it allowed me to merge two different passions, like my love for music and film. And again, with Dream Recording, I just found that jazz at that time was very cinematic. And so there isn't always like as good as synergies between music and film. Like anyone can just do a music biopic on anybody. Of course you can do that, but it's also like tonally and visually, do they work together? And the thing I like, I've always loved about jazz is just the the improvisational quality. There's a certain organicness to that, and I think you can then use that to influence the tone of your film. And that's always intrigued me, even from those early days.
I don't want to read too much into the love of Raging Bull, but one thing that Scorsese is obviously esteemed for is his connection, obviously, between fiction and documentary, and his bringing of music into organically and elegantly into his cinema. If you could talk about your own sort of drawing of songs you've wanted to use maybe as a short film, and your ability to actually include them to do some of the heavy lifting, when that time that you're in the editing booth and thinking, well, if I put this song in, I think that it might actually lift what it is that I'm doing.
No, it was certainly when because Scorsese is one of the people that I really fell in love with when I fell in love with film. And, seeing something like Mean Streets, some of these other films where this guy's making these, like Mean Streets is a pretty small independent movie. He's got the Rolling Stones all over it. It's just got this like rock and roll soundtrack.
Yeah, because you could get away not having clearance back then.
In those days. But yeah, I mean, Scorsese's certainly been the master of using rock and even if you look at a film, if you look at Raging Bull, there is no score. It's classical music. It's Italian classical, and it's different. But if you look at the sound, there's no composer on Raging Bull, which is extraordinary. When you watch the movie, it feels full of magic and music. But Scorsese just takes tidbits from different classical pieces and other pieces and sculptures them. Unlike Taxi Driver, which is like an old-fashioned Herman score, very Hitchcockian, which is great in its own way. And so You know, with Born to Be Blue, which was the jazz movie I made a couple years ago about Chet Baker, that was more obvious because it was a music film and there was musical performance. And so almost all the music in that movie is either Ethan Hawke performing as Chet Baker or similar jazz. And then I hired a composer, the same guy who did Dream Recording with me, my very first short film. He kind of quasi-scored it using the jazz in the Chet Baker. So that had its own kind of set of rules for the music. Stockholm was the first film where I was able to kind of really celebrate a certain soundtrack. And Stockholm is this bank heist film that's playing here that is set in the 70s, and so I wanted to create this early 70s tone, but also capture the kind of black comedic quality of the film. And I was able to get a lot of Bob Dylan tracks in the film, which is obviously very exciting for me since I'm such a huge Dylan fan. So there's like 4 or 5 Dylan songs, and then there's 4 or 5 other lesser known 70s tunes. But for me, it's not just putting in my favorite Dylan songs because I think they're good. It's about finding the right songs that work for the tone of the film, and sometimes resisting using songs just because you like them, because that doesn't always work. Like it might make you feel good as a director to have them in there, but I was able to integrate into the script itself some Dylan songs because the bank robber in Stockholm actually was singing constantly. He was singing Elvis Presley's Lonesome Cowboy. I couldn't actually get the rights to Elvis Presley, and I realized I could get Dylan songs in a way more easily, and so it just worked out really well.
We're going to bounce back and forth, and obviously some extraordinary stories here. But sort of between doing all your shorts, I guess a dozen shorts, you then have your first feature in 2006, That Beautiful Somewhere, Roy Dupuis, Jane McGregor, and Gordon Toutsoukis. The film is a sort of noir. It has detective elements. It has procedural elements. It's a sort of a forensic pathologist going into a bog and uncovering bodies, but also very spiritual. It also deals with indigenous spirituality and the notion of sacrifice and love. Very heady stuff for a first-time feature. I'm just wondering if you could talk about getting that story together and what drew you to these disparate elements. Also, it was sort of unclear where it was set. I assume it was shot in Northern Ontario, but it seems that there's a Franco-Ontarian element to the film that is very overt as well. I'm just wondering if you could talk about all those different elements coming together and having sort of the chutzpah to make a first film.
So I had made an OMDC calling card film called Dry Whiskey. That was kind of like my longest short film. That was like a 25-minute short film in 2004, 2005. And these
the OMDC
is the Ontario Media Development Corporation. So that's the equivalent to here, I guess it's BC Film. It's like the provincial funder. They had a program called the Calling Card Program, which allows filmmakers to make a bigger short film, a longer one, and they give you quite a bit of money. You can shoot it on 35 millimeter. It's like a very fancy short film program. They've gotten rid of that now, but the idea for that is that you could use that as a calling card to get your feature. And I was lucky enough that it actually worked. And these producers from North Bay saw that, and there was a book written by a professor in North Bay called Loon, quite a strange kind of book. And I kept certain aspects of the book, the Aboriginal mysticism and the kind of key relationships and the power of the kind of water and the healing. I took some of that, but then I had to change, like often, as one often does, have to change certain elements. My parents are both from Northern Ontario. My dad's from North Bay, which is around where we shot it, and my mother is French-Canadian. She's from Témiscamingue, Quebec. And so the Francophone element, maybe there's a personal connection to my family. But then Roy Dupuis, being a French-Canadian, obviously kind of brings that element. Originally, actually, we had an Aboriginal actor named Adam Beach was originally attached, and fairly late in the game, he got cast by Clint Eastwood in Flags of Our Fathers. So he called me up and said, Clinton literally knocked on his door and said, "I want you," and he said yes. And then he called me and said he was
really, what a weird career decision. Who knew?
And so Roy came in, but it was a real blessing because Roy was such an intense, interesting actor.
So originally Adam Beach was in the Roy Dupuis role.
Yeah, and I ended up doing quite a bit of rewriting fairly late in the game to kind of retailor the role a little bit, because obviously
That would be a very different film, because not to give too much away about the film, but the central character sort of becomes engrossed in indigenous elements, but of course he himself is not indigenous, and so there's a conflict between the sort of outsider within the general population, the French outsider within an Anglo society. But you're saying originally it was actually an indigenous person in conflict with other indigenous people.
yeah, and it was a different type of conflict because he was already in that
Right.
world, and so that's why the film had to change it. It actually added more conflict with Roy because of that, and it shifted it. Like, these things always kind of organically shift sometimes around your lead cast. That film in particular shifted more than others.
Now, it says it takes place in Madison. Was it meant to be Madison, Ontario, or Madison, Wisconsin? Or were you just vague about where it was meant to take place?
Well, we shot it in Temagami, and it was, which is in northern Ontario, and the idea was it's just kind of supposed to take place in this kind of northern Canadian
But Canada.
place, but Canada. But we, I can't remember now, but I don't think we were super specific about it being Canadian. Like, to me, films always work better if they have a certain universal quality. I mean, my latest film, Stockholm, is called Stockholm, so it's clearly set in Stockholm, and it's about a syndrome set in Stockholm. But even that, within that, we try to craft a story and do it in such a way that it plays universal and not too regional. And so with that beautiful somewhere, we tried to keep it a bit more kind of expressionistic and abstract in terms of regionality.
And so you've now made your first feature. It goes on. It gets some award success. But you've had challenges such as losing your primary actor, but getting another actor who was obviously quite extraordinary in the role. Just wondering, just getting over that that hurdle of doing your first feature, what it felt like, first of all, and the encouragement that it did to get you to sort of seek on and continue doing other projects.
It's one of those things where you get your first feature done, and it seems like such a feat because you've been building to, after making short films, to making a feature, and you're very excited, and we had some nice premieres, but then in the grand scheme of things, you're like, okay, what's next? And sometimes you forget, in the bigger world picture, that was just a very small Canadian film that, like, not that many people ultimately saw. And so you think, okay, great, now I can try to do something bigger and better that can reach more audience, because that's ultimately what you want to do, is just have people see your work. And so that film, after that film, I took a crack for many years actually at a bunch of quite bigger films, and a bunch of them kind of seemed like they'd be closed and they didn't quite happen.
Are you willing to say what any of them are?
There was one project. I had like a 1940 spy thriller called The Night Committee, which was based on a true story of this kind of espionage in Manhattan at the time that Europeans were at war, but the Americans were not at war, and it deals with the politics of Roosevelt, and so I spent several years, writing that script, putting it together. But it was a bigger movie. Like The Beautiful Somewhere was like a couple of million bucks, whereas this Night Committee project was more like a $10 million project. And so, in a sense, I've been fortunate in that I've been able to, on my projects, to sometimes wear a producer hat and understand that part of the business. But it's one of the risks, when you go out to make these bigger movies, they're obviously harder to put together, and so there's a greater chance that they may not come together, as opposed to staying modest and trying something smaller. So you learn over the course of your career sometimes when to push and when not to, depending on how many things you have. But that can certainly affect, how quickly you make your next movie, in a sense.
So between 2006 and then your next feature listed, anyway, is 2015, and it's Born to Be Blue. Extraordinary film if you haven't seen it. Life of Chet Baker, played here Whistler to great acclaim. but also introduce you not only to bringing music back into it, but also working with Ethan Hawke. I'm wondering if you could talk about your own connection to Chet Baker and his music, having the compunction to tell his story, but also connecting with such an extraordinary performer who obviously continues to help shape your work.
Well, as I said before, I've always loved jazz, and the first film I made was this 40s, 50s jazz film. So it was certainly in my blood to potentially do a jazz feature. But I also knew that there's certain challenges with that because a lot of those jazz artists live these really tough lives. They're period films. Jazz is, it used to be the popular music of America at the time, but now it's a fairly obscure, more niche type of music. And so when I came across the Chet Baker story, I first came across it when I saw a lot of other people trying to make it, like, DiCaprio and Brad Pitt and Johnny Depp. All these people had loved the romance and the mystique of this kind of Kerouac-like junkie, and people had tried to make Chet Baker films in Hollywood for like 10 years. As is often the case, Hollywood chases these things, but for various reasons they don't get made. And when I looked more into Chet Baker's story, I did see it as like something that could be made universal, and because Chet Baker wasn't so big like a Miles Davis, that it almost makes it easier because there's less pressure to live up to a certain thing, and there's less pressure to like make it like a typical biopic, which can be quite kind of boring and TV like.
And one thing that I think it gives you the opportunity, because a lot of people don't know his actual story, you can, like jazz, sort of improvise with the actual facts, that you can tell his story in a way that's engaging to the audience, but not so hard onto the facts of the case that it's not a documentary. It's a representation of this character, which seems to affect very much about how you deal with true stories.
Yeah, and it was, I found a way into the Chet Baker story because when I was doing research, I found out that he himself had tried to. It was supposed to make a movie where he was going to star as himself, and when I read that, I thought, oh, this is an interesting angle. It's almost like a Charlie Kaufman-esque kind of conceit, and I could use that to kind of riff on this idea of truth and what's reimagined and how much do we really know, and because jazz is improvisational, I thought, okay, that's a way to make it, because otherwise it's the typical story where, this young, beautiful guy rises to fame, does drugs, goes, like, it's like the exact same story that you see all the time. And so I found this unique and that's what really got me excited about it.
One of the great things about Chet Baker that the film reflects upon, for those, again, who will now go and see it, that Chet lost his instrument. That by his drug use not only affected his health, but actually destroyed his embouchure and had to be relearned. That whole notion of losing the art. Is that another connection that you felt? The whole notion that you are striving so hard to actually get something made, that the danger of having it get lost is even more telling into a character?
Yeah, I hadn't actually ever thought of that, but in some ways, there's something akin to the sports drama in the Chet Baker story that I told, because like a lot of sports stories, they're really about rehabilitation and, an athlete or someone getting injured and then having to come back and fight his nemesis in the ultimate match. And in this case, Chet Baker is this rising star, and then he literally gets injured. He gets his teeth all smashed out, so he can't play the trumpet, just like a piano player losing his hands or an athlete blowing their knee out. And then he literally has to physically come back and mentally overcome these things, and then kind of like face his demon in Miles Davis at Birdland. And so growing up, I was always into lots of sports, and so I was very familiar with that world and that archetype. And so even though you'd never think of a sports element to the Chet Baker movie, the kind of bones of that rehabilitation story actually kind of come from sports, at least for me.
Well, again, I don't want to psychologize you too much, but there's a lot of Raging Bull in that story. There's a lot of a notion of the career person who is now over the hill and looking back upon his career and recognizing the mistakes that he himself made. So maybe this Raging Bull really does continue to actually play a major role in your film. But we talked about Ethan Hawke. Again, your connection with him, how you got him as being part of the project, and what he was like working with on that project.
So Ethan, ironically, he was always my very first choice for the film, but for various reasons, we didn't go out to him first, which was very frustrating for me. I mean, Born to Be Blue itself was a project that took probably 4 or 5 years to get together, not only to write, but then to finance and to lose financing and piece it back together and lose actor, piece it back together. So that also accounts for a large portion of that gap, was like just getting that damn movie made. But Ethan, we just made him like a traditional offer. We went to his agent and said, we're making this movie, we're offering you this amount. You know, this is the role. There was nothing special. We had no connection to him. But the stars were aligned in the sense that I knew that he had tried to do a Chet Baker movie about 10 or 15 years earlier with Richard Linklater about a young Chet Baker, which was kind of like the Chet Baker at the start of Born to Be Blue. And I didn't know if that would hurt or help. Sometimes actors, if they've tried to do something and couldn't do it, they just never want to go back there. Ethan, it turned out, was really still interested in Chet Baker. And he happened to be shooting this other movie that he was really hating doing in Toronto at the time where I lived. And so he got back fairly quickly, and we were able to get together. And it was just, he was very, very passionate about it, and he was in town for the summer, and we just started getting together all the time and developing this relationship, and I was reworking the script with him, and it just kind of was one of those things that finally came together, and I found the right guy.
There's got to be worse things in life than hanging out with Ethan Hawke in Toronto on a sunny day. Carmen Adjego, her contribution to it is so extraordinary. If you talk about casting her, must have been an incredible challenge as well.
Yeah. So Carmen Ejogo plays the female lead in this film, Born to Be Blue, and it was a challenge because one of the for those who haven't seen Born to Be Blue, one of the themes that we explore is kind of race relations in America in the 50s and 60s, and in relation to jazz. And because Chet Baker was this beautiful white jazz guy who sang, God forbid he sang, he took a lot of heat for that because, he sold a lot of his records because he was beautiful, and he kind of appealed to almost this white female pop audience, which was sacrilegious.
I mean, I've always described him as the Morrissey of jazz, right? It's this very, the reveling in the misery is what he did, this incredible notion, yes.
So many of most of the great jazz artists are African American, and so including his idols, Charlie Parker and Miles Davis and Dizzy Gillespie. And so the film, race is an important part of the film, and it was important. Chet Baker, one of his wives, was a mixed race woman, and this is a reimagining, and I kind of combined all his wives into this one character, but it was very important that she be mixed race. And so it's and this was 4 or 5 years ago, but it certainly highlighted the absence of diversity in Hollywood. It becomes a fairly limited casting pool when you're trying to find a fairly experienced actress that's mixed race that kind of fits a certain thing. There's certainly still a fair number of actors options, but it became a more specific search, but also one that was much more interesting. And Ethan and I spent quite a bit of time talking to different people, and Carmen just had this this kind of elegant beauty, and she also she was in a movie called before Selma. She did this movie. What was it called? It was like this Diana Ross glitter. No, it wasn't glitter, but it was this. It was she certainly knows the music world, and she sings, and she understood that, and she was very excited by that. And she had a very different approach to acting than Ethan. Carmen's originally from the UK, and so she had to deal with the American accent, and so improv was trickier for her because she had to be a bit more prepared. With Ethan, it was the exact opposite. We were trying to always throw each other off in improv as much as possible to kind of capture the tone of the character in the film. And so it was one of the challenges was reconcile. It's often one of the challenges of a movie if it's a two-hander and your two leads have slightly different approaches, is just reconciling what they bring to make sure that it all still works. And it's great if you can create some conflict in it, but it can't be too much.
And again, shooting in Sudbury. I mean, you're making Sudbury in the winter, as you say, look like Los Angeles in the 1950s.
Yeah, for those of you who don't know, Sudbury is about 5 hours north of Toronto, and so it's we were shot in October, November. So in the movie, there's certainly snow on the ground. By that point, for the most part, we were inside, but it was a real challenge shooting in this small, kind of grimy northern town in the winter to make it look like sunny California in the 50s.
Now, was it strictly to get the look, the sort of out-of-time look that Sudbury has, or is it also to take advantage of the Northern Ontario tax credit?
It was mostly to take advantage of the money, the tax credit.
There we go.
But
this is how you make films in Canada, is you're smart.
But the reality is, Sudbury was really good in a lot of ways because it did have a lot of old 50s buildings, and for independent movies, you want to find building. You don't want to have to build. You want to build as little as possible. So we found some great 50s buildings that we could just augment. We got great tax incentives, and it also meant that a lot of our key crew was away from home. So you go up there, it's almost like you're all going to camp together for 5 or 6 weeks, and you all get closer. And there's less. Like Ethan didn't have much to do at night, so we hung out in the hotel room, in the bar, and kind of worked on the script. In Toronto, the actors can go off and get into trouble and do all kinds of things. When you're in a more isolated community, they might bitch about it a bit, but it's actually I think it really helps because it becomes a real community.
And working with David Braid again on music, a connection with your short film, and continuing that love of music.
Yeah, it was one of the really nice things about Born to Be Blue is that I was able to go back to my very first short film at a film school with David, and I'd kept up that relationship with David. And he's just such a generous guy, and he was helpful in helping the actors, and he did such a great job kind of doing all those, the trick for David was to capture, in this case, because we didn't use any of Chet Baker's originals. We re-recorded everything. So he wanted to capture the spirit of Chet Baker, but not mimic it. Ethan didn't want to mimic Chet Baker, and Kevin Turcotte, who is our trumpet player, didn't want to mimic him. But at the same time, it still had to sound very Chet Baker-like and as good. So
just take a moment. Challenge. Kevin Turcotte, one of the greatest trumpet players in the history of trumpet, but we'll just go on with that. A modern jazz master, but anyway, yes.
Yeah, no, Kevin was great, and the thing that Kevin did that was so exceptional is that he did all the trumpets. So he did Chet Baker's very unique style, but then he also did like Miles Davis and Dizzy Gillespie and these other guys who have a total different bebop style. And so we were fortunate in that we had really great jazz musicians, which we obviously needed to do a movie like that.
So you're shooting LA and Sudbury, and then you decide to shoot Scandinavia and Hamilton, Ontario. Steeltown, I'm just wondering, it brings us to Stockholm, your 2018 film. Congratulations. It had its premiere in Tribeca. Again, back to the De Niro. I'm finding all these connections here. It's what we do. It's the story behind the Stockholm story notion, a bank robbery where the people who are taken hostage find an affinity with the people that have taken them hostage as opposed to the police that are ostensibly there to rescue them. First of all, if you could talk about finding this story, reading the New Yorker, I believe, article, and bringing Ethan back in on this, bringing an American voice into an originally Swedish story.
So the film Stockholm came about because there was some producer and a sales agent in Los Angeles who had really liked Born to Be Blue, and I was talking to them about projects, and they brought me this article written by a great writer named Daniel Lang, who's now dead, but he wrote this article called The Bank Drama in 1975. It was very much like Dog Day Afternoon, which is the Al Pacino movie, which happens in 1973 in Brooklyn, was based on an article in Life magazine. This is basically kind of a Swedish version, in a sense, of Dog Day, in a way. And but the article was written by an American who went to Stockholm after the events in '73 and wrote this amazing article, kind of about this really sad but quite absurd event. And so the article was a great, obviously, introduction for me. There was, because it was a real story, there was piles and piles of research I was able to do. But the article was already from an American perspective. It already had a bit of a kind of darkly comic tone to it. Like I think the movie has a even stronger, darkly comic tone than the article, but it certainly kind of has fun with just the sheer absurdity of even of just kind of Swedish culture in the 70s, and so that's how I came to it. And very early on, I saw the lead role of the bank robber, this crazy bank robber who kind of dresses up like an American, uses an accent, pretends he's one person, but he's actually got this good heart. He's kind of known for being this good-hearted guy. And he goes into the bank, and his goal isn't to get money. His goal is to break his best friend out of prison. He tried to break his best friend out of prison once and failed. And so he thinks, okay, I'll rob a bank. I'll try it this way. And I just immediately thought of Ethan. Because with Born to be Blue, he did a really great job in Chet Baker, who's really could have come across as this dark, difficult character, but Ethan brought a lot of lightness to him, and he's always kind of lovable and empathetic. And I needed that with this character as well. And
again, connecting him with a tremendous actress like Noomi Rapace, very different styles, very different method of working. Again, the dynamic between Ethan and Carmen. Was it a similar thing on set this time, that you had two very different energies that were working with and sometimes against each other?
Yeah, it was very similar. I mean, in Stockholm, because the whole film is a balancing of tones. Like on one hand, there's a very serious, dramatic, thriller-esque element, and on the other hand, there's this kind of almost Fargo-esque dark comedy element. And the comedic element is really Ethan's character, because he's this over-the-top bank robber character who's on speed and just kind of whacked out. And then Noomi Rapace plays one of the bank clerks who thinks, for days on end she could die at any moment. And so she, in her mind, she's in a thriller. And so that was one of the fun things, but also one of the challenges on the day shooting it, was reconciling those two things. But that was just inherent in the characters. But then also in the edit room, whenever you're doing a film that's got this type of tone, you need to still keep a certain unity and consistency, but balance it. And so that was why I was attracted to it in the first place, because it wasn't just, if it had just been a straightforward thriller, I don't think I would have did it. And it would have been a different movie. I think we've seen that movie.
I mean, obviously this is your latest film, but is in some ways this your hardest film because of that tonal challenge. Because if this film could easily be too much of a thriller, and then it becomes a little bit pedestrian for a thriller, and become too much a farce, then you stop caring about the sort of intensity. Getting the balance right is the hardest thing to do. Therefore, is this your hardest film?
Yeah, I mean, tonally, it's certainly the trickiest film to balance that. And with Born to be Blue, it was easier because we pre-recorded like 40 minutes of jazz, and I knew the tone, and it was a slow-paced melancholy, but that was Chet Baker, and we committed to that tone like months before we even shot the movie. With Stockholm, it really was tricky to balance that absurdity, and like you said, if you lean too far into one thing, people then just don't take it all seriously. But if you go the other direction, I didn't really realize how tricky it was to make those kind of black comedic dramedy type movies. But it's not easy.
Apparently, you've pulled it off. Are there any questions from the audience? Well then, yeah, there we go. How do you manage that balancing act between two disparate actors?
It's probably different in different cases, but I think one of the first things you need to do is just get the three of you in the room and communicate what each other is feeling, because in the case of Born to be Blue, it was a Chet Baker story, and it was really Ethan and I's movie, and Carmen was just because she was the minor character, was kind of the third wheel in the group of collaborators. That's just the nature of it. And so I think she was feeling that, and so it was really important that we had some talks, and she was able to voice her concerns, and we tried as best we could to Ethan and I tried to kind of help her with that stuff. But ultimately we had to make a choice that this movie has to be done a certain way, and we kind of have to do it this way. and we tried to support her and helping her make it that way, but she just kind of had to catch up and do that. You know, to a certain degree, you have to kind of make choices, but it really depends on the dynamics of the people, but also what's best for the movie. Stockholm was very different in that I viewed Stockholm as an even two-hander. Like Ethan's character and Numi's character were equal in terms of importance, and in terms of the balancing of the tones and what I needed was equal. In the Chet Baker movie, it wasn't. It was like the Chet Baker show, and so that by default kind of had to win out. When it's more evenly matched, you know, it could have been trickier, but we spent a decent amount of time together in advance, workshopping the script and talking, and those two developed a really strong, really good relationship very early on, and really respected each other, and so there wasn't actually really any conflict between them. It was more just in the tone. That was more something I had to deal with.
Were there moments that you would shoot it away, maybe that Carmen was asking for, knowing you might not actually use it, but the exercise of simply capturing it on film is worthwhile for her to get to a character point of view? Or simply when you're making an independent film, you don't have the luxury of doing that, of trying the different versions and knowing in post you're going to quote-unquote fix it?
Yeah. On Born to Be Blue, I didn't have that luxury. It was on Stockholm, because Ethan's character was so big on Stockholm. I encouraged him, and he pushed me to try a lot of really crazy stuff, and he went way beyond what I needed. But the only way to get some of the gold, some of the really good lines and stuff, was to let him do that, because otherwise you're never going to get it. And so on Stockholm, we did a lot more of that, where I knew a lot of the stuff I wasn't going to use, but unless I let him go for it, I wasn't going to get it. So Numi would sometimes come up to me and say, like, what the heck is going on here? And I'm like, don't worry. I know I'll be able to cut this out, because, especially having cut Ethan before.
How many takes would you give?
I usually only do maybe 3 or 4, 5. I don't tend to like to do a lot of takes.
Do you tend to use take 5?
It depends. I think I tend to use take 2 or 3 often. But if you get into 5 or 6, it usually means I would never do 5 or 6 takes unless something wasn't working. So then I probably would use that high of a number. But in an ideal world, you do 2 or 3 takes, and that's all you should need.
So you're not doing the Kubrick 102 takes?
No. I mean, even if I had tons of money, I don't think I would do that, because once you establish a certain rhythm with the actors, if they see that you're always doing that many takes, they're not going to bring it anyways. And it's not like the Clint Eastwood method where he'll give you like 1 or 2 takes, like always, and I'm not like religiously hardcore like that, but you can also burn them out. And so I don't tend to shoot tons and tons of coverage. I just think it's important to really prepare with them, really rehearse, get what you want, and try to do fewer number of takes so that they can pour what they need into it. But then also I like to, sometimes if I know I've got it on take 3, I like to just try another take for fun and just say, try something, or I'll whisper something one actor's ear and they're just going to mess with the other actor, and then I might try to catch a reaction. It's always sometimes fun if I have time to do an extra take to see if I can just create something.
Oh, the luxury of time. Are there any other questions from the audience? Yes. Are you thinking about sound design as well as music in your film in a specific artistic sense?
I think for some films more than others, you do, because to me, I either think about score or sound design, and sometimes they overlap depending on the type of film or the type of genre. Some genres, like the more you get into thriller and horrors and stuff, there's an overlap between sound design. And I've worked with a certain composer, Steve London, who sometimes has quite kind of sound designy scores, and so some of that design is built in. On Stockholm, the goal with Stockholm, for example, was because it was only set in a few locations, I wanted to keep it quite naturalistic. And so there was a lot of source 70s music, and there ended up being more score than I imagined there would be. But I looked a lot at Dog Day Afternoon, which is an extreme version. There's no score in Dog Day Afternoon at all. There's nothing. It's just sound design. It's really hard to pull that off nowadays. People don't have the attention span for that slow 70s. I wish they did because I love it. And so I certainly think about it. Also, if there's a montage type section that I think could be scored or sound designed, sometimes you shoot that in a certain way, knowing that either sound design or music is going to help with, the camera movement or the way you're going to have to design that sequence.
Yeah, and the most famous scene in Dog Day Afternoon, though, is a tribal-like chant. So of him screaming Attica. There was another question over here. Yeah. As a director, if you could go back, what is something that you would spend ideally more time on?
I often find that there's often never enough true rehearsal time. I've been lucky working with Ethan because he kind of comes from a more collaborative background from theater and working with Richard Linklater. Ethan's certainly into spending a pretty good amount of time before jamming on stuff, but a lot of times you don't have that. So I always wish there was more time to prepare with cast. And then, inevitably on a lot of independent movies, you wish there was more time, in the days to do your coverage. It was one of the trade-offs with shooting up north, and even in Hamilton, we had great incentives, but it meant that we had to shoot pretty short days for various reasons. And so, sometimes, you want more time to do coverage, but for the most part, I've been quite happy. It's more just I often find there's never enough time in prep, and so much of I think so much of your movie is done in prep, in terms of working with the actors, getting the script right, and then it's just executing it. But if you haven't prepped properly, then it can be very difficult.
I know with Linklater, Ethan's improvisatory nature is they do a lot of rehearsal, then he writes down the rehearsal, and that becomes sort of a more locked down script. That, as a writer, director, is that one of the ways that you do it? Rather than having wild improvisation on screen, do you have the luxury, as per the time question, of developing the character from the initial script to create a shooting script based on the input from the actors?
No, it's a good point because, in Stockholm there was a bit of on-set improv because Ethan plays this larger-than-life character shouting kind of funny obscenities and stuff. But for the most part, when I say improv, a lot of it is working on the script the night before, the week before, the morning of, hearing the actors talk about it, scratching out lines, coming up with new lines. Ethan suggesting stuff. He always suggests like a million things, and you just have to find the gems in his ideas.
We think Robin Williams often when we think of improvisation. This machine is just making stuff up. But if you have a plot, that's very hard to actually manage.
Well, that's the thing, and again, it depends on the actors you're working with. Some are more forthcoming with that. A guy like Ethan is a writer. I worked with Mark Strong. He was like the third lead on Stockholm. He didn't really.
Sorry, did you get him to do your answering machine message? That's the only reason I think. But Mark Strong has this incredible voice. I would just get him to do my answering machine message.
He certainly, he has an amazing presence and voice. But he's a very traditional, I think, British actor, like classically trained to a certain degree, and fantastic. But he doesn't really care about improv. He just wants to know his lines. He wants to do his lines really good, very straightforward. Always willing to give you feedback and suggestions, but not like Ethan in that sense, and that's equally great. I mean,
how do you feed an actor like that? To this original question, how do you feed an actor like that when somebody like Ethan is going crazy, to make sure that somebody like Mark is comfortable with the improvisation going on? That it's not that you're dealing with somebody who's here playing a bunch of jazz runs and he's trying to play classical.
Well, it's doing a bit of management because when Mark first came to set and he saw Ethan jumping around on tables and acting crazy, he was just like, whoa. But very quickly he realized, like, that film, he plays the second bank robber, and it's kind of a buddy film. And so Mark was playing the straight guy, and he really quickly realized in this buddy relationship, oh, this is what it is. And he quickly kind of slid into place. He's a very generous ensemble-like actor. And
so there was never a moment that he called his agent?
No, and him and Ethan got on really, really well, and really respected each other going in, and we're really excited to work together. So again, a lot of that helps. Just if they all get there on the same page, wanting to work together, which isn't always the case. But
I guess we have time for one last question. Yeah, please. Was the tonal duality there on the page between something that's a more broad comedic element and a more dark procedural element?
No, the duality was there on the page. The reason I did the project was because there was a duality. It was one of the things that when you're putting a movie together, you have different distributors who need to buy into it for you to get it financed. And it was the biggest thing that constantly came up is, this is absurd. Like, how are you going to handle the tone? What's the tone? What's the tone? It's absurd. And I'm like, yeah, that is the tone. It's a kind of an absurdist black comedy drama.
You use the word absurd in the title.
Yeah.
Absurd
based on an absurd true story. I mean, it seems like there's more and more films, even like a film, I, Tonya last year was kind of a pretty serious movie, but a black comedy. Stockholm is different. It's not maybe as consistently black comedy as that, but Linklater did a movie called Bernie with Jack Black, which is like a crazy, insane black comedy. There's quite a few films like that out there, and they are tricky to do, but you also have to tell the audience right off the bat that that's what it is. It was one of the tricks when we were first testing it, doing rough cuts. Audiences just came thinking, this is a super serious movie about abusive women in situations, and then Ethan's, the movie, the comedic elements are actually at the top of the movie, and people are like, whoa, we're not supposed to be laughing at this. But if you give them permission to laugh and you can set it up, and that's the nice thing, when you actually release a movie, you can have a trailer and artwork. At festivals, you don't actually have that as much, at least. People know they can laugh, and they know that it's okay to laugh and to cry right off the bat. Then they'll do that, and they give themselves permission. So it was one of the things that we worked to do, is to make sure it was clear that that was our intention. It wasn't an accident. It's not accidentally supposed to be funny.
There you go. Very, very briefly, what do you have coming up next? Because I know Stockholm, I guess, was done a while ago. Here it is on the festival circuit. What's your next big project?
Yeah, I never really know. I have I kind of have a Western thriller. I have a 40s French musical.
Of course.
I have like a South African diamond heist film. I have a bunch of different movies in different genres, all trying to come together. And then I'm also trying to develop some cable TV series, 2 or 3 different cable TV series. And so.
And will Ethan Hawke be in all of them?
That'd be good. He certainly, hopefully, will be in a few of them. We're constantly talking about things we can do together. I don't know if he'll be in the next one. It's sometimes what comes together first, especially if you're trying to, when you do bigger and bigger movies, they're even more fragile kind of creatures, and so you just have to be hopeful that you have enough of them moving in a direction that one of them kind of comes together.
Well, we'll be hopeful with you, and based on what we've seen before, I think that we are assured of success. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.